That Gilded Age, the period between about 1870 and the turn of the century, was a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth in the United States. Wages increased nearly 60% in the period, but very unevenly. Millions of new immigrants and blacks in the South suffering under Jim Crow laws lived in abject poverty, while the very wealthy lived ostentatiously and fought unions and regulations with an iron fist. It's how the Gilded Age got its name, actually coined by Mark Twain, saying it was not a golden age, but an age of enormous social problems that was covered over with a thin gold gilding. And perhaps no single person represents the contradictions of that age more than Hetty Green. She was one of the wealthiest people in America in the era, and so popular, so well known that she was the subject of songs, and yet, on the other hand, was such a notorious spendthrift that the Guinness Book of World Records has labeled her the world's greatest miser. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Henrietta Howland Robinson was born in 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She was the daughter of Edward Mott Robinson and Abby Howland, Quakers who owned a large whaling fleet. New Bedford had become a hub of the whaling industry in the 1760s, when prominent whaling families relocated there from Boston, Newport, and Providence. Many in the town were Quakers who had strict principles of egalitarianism and community building. In 1857, when whaling was at its height, New Bedford was the richest city per capita in the world, and Hetty's family was near its top. Her father was called the Napoleon of our little business community. Hetty would be the pair's only surviving child. Her parents sent her to live with her grandfather when she was just 2. With his sight failing, Hetty would read aloud stock quotations and commerce reports and help her grandfather with his correspondence. At 8, Hetty collected all the money she had ever been given or earned and opened an account at the bank. As she grew older, she followed her father to the warehouses and docks and learned to read ledgers and trade commodities with brokers. A girl acquires the habit of keeping track of every cent, gets the most value for every dollar she spends, she said later. She was sent to live in New York City for a while, and her parents gave her $1,200 for living expenses. She spent very little on living expenses and invested most of the money. The 20-year-old proudly proclaimed, "That investment went so well that I soon made many others." Hetty continued to dress modestly for her entire life, so much so that her Aunt Sylvia thought that she dressed shabbily. In return, Hetty criticized her aunt's clothes, her large staff of servants, and her indulgences. Her father instilled the idea that it was his job, and then later hers, to increase the family's wealth. Her father got out of the whaling industry just in time, and turned instead to oil, which had just been discovered in Pennsylvania. Kerosene would make whale oil nearly obsolete. In 1864, she met Edward Green at a Boston hotel. Hetty walked into the hotel room and Mr. Green fell for her, a family member later said. Green was 14 years her senior, a millionaire already. They were engaged in the summer of 1865 as her father grew sick. Her father wanted Hetty to marry a man who could manage the money, but he also stipulated that Hetty's inheritance would be separate and apart from any husband she married and free from the debts, control, or interference of any such husband. When he died, most of his $6 million fortune was left in a trust, and she felt betrayed. Her wealthy Aunt Sylvia died shortly afterwards, and Hetty would spend years in court fighting for her inheritance. Hetty was her aunt's only relation, and a will had stipulated that all would be left to her, but a physician who cared for Sylvia had helped her write a new will that left much of the money to him. Hetty was left $1 million in a trust to be managed by the physician. She would only get income from the investments. She went straight to court. Her father had told her that he had been poisoned, and Hetty became paranoid that people were trying to steal her money. "For days I did not leave my room, lived on crackers and raw eggs. All the time those schemers were trying to get my money." Hetty's case went all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court for one reason. Attached to the will where she had left everything to Hetty was a letter which said that her aunt was hereby revoking all wills made before or after this one. "I implore the judge to decide in favor of this will if another was found after her death." The physician maintained that the signature on the letter was forged. The case remains important because of a forensic study of that signature. Simultaneously, Hetty continued to foster her fortune. After the Civil War, she bought devalued greenbacks, paper money secured not by gold, but only by the government's promise, at 50 cents to the dollar. She was a contrarian investor. "I buy when things are low and nobody wants them," she said. "I keep them until they go up and people are crazy to get them. That is, I believe, the secret of all successful business." The government would later stand by their promise of the greenbacks, and Hetty pocketed a handsome profit. Hetty married Edward Green on July 11th, 1867, but she insisted that he renounce all claim to her money before she would say, "I do." The pair moved to England, where they had 2 children. Hetty made use of dividends from the trust to invest carefully. Most important to her was compound interest, essentially interest on the interest, and she invested cautiously and smartly. In one day of that year, I added a clean $200,000 to my bank account. That's the most I ever made in one day, she would brag. By the end of her first year in London, her profits were up to $1.25 million, roughly $22 million in 2021 adjusted dollars. While others speculated and borrowed money, she never borrowed, and when bubbles burst, her money was safe. Through meticulous research, she invested in railroads she thought were making good decisions for the country's growth. The Panic of 1873 reverberated around the world, ruined rich men, but Hetty had cash on hand, like she always did, and she saw opportunity instead of ruin, as she would in other panics. When no one else would buy anything, Hetty did. The Greens came back to the U.S. that year, living with Edward's mother in Vermont. Hetty's scrupulous cheapness made her a stranger to the wealthy. She insisted on shopping herself or sending a friend instead of sending the maid, because she was sure that merchants would up their prices when they saw a maid shopping. She was a master haggler, which only decreased her reputation in the eyes of society. The wealthy shouldn't look for deals or bargains for potatoes, they thought. When Edward's mother died, Hetty put away the silver and the china for simple kitchenware. Edward was so furious he smashed a goblet. Edward had lost his money in the Panic, and Hetty had to loan him money, and in exchange she sold his mother's fine goods. In what some consider to be the most egregious example of her miserliness, her son Ned fell from a tree and hurt his knee badly. She sent for a doctor, but the doctor was miles away, and she made a poultice for the wound herself. She thought she'd fixed it. When the doctor came, I waved him away and called him that he wasn't needed. If he'd gotten out of his buggy, I'd had to pay him, even if he didn't do anything, you know? Another version says that she first attempted to have him admitted to a free clinic for the poor and treated Ned herself when they demanded that she pay. Ned's injury didn't heal, and though they now went to doctors, Hetty often in the shabbiest of clothes to avoid being charged more for appearing wealthy, it was no use. The leg was amputated many years later. In 1884, Edward's gambles went bad again, and this time brought her bank with it. She demanded that her money be withdrawn, but the bank refused. She had $500,000 in cash there, a quarter of the bank's assets, and $26 million in bonds. The bank said that their husband owed over $700,000, and they didn't care that her money was separate. They intended to hold her money as collateral for his debt. She threatened to sue, but in the end she was forced to pay her husband's debt. But she took her money and put it in a new bank. Physically, so much that they had to find a second carriage to carry it across town. Suing over her aunt's will was only Hetty's first foray into the courtroom. She would sue often afterwards. She even threatened to when a Paris merchant sent her lace inferior to what she had picked out. She sued the bank for taking her money, never forgave Edward for losing it. They stayed married, but she bid him farewell nonetheless. She worked at the chemical bank on her finances, but she refused to pay for a private office, and instead worked at open desks or on the floor. She spent nearly as much time in court as she did at the bank, suing various people over all kinds of financial issues. And she worked. Before deciding on an investment, I seek out every kind of information about it, and she meant it. She loaned millions to the city of New York at low rates, and the city comptroller once said that she watched the money currents so closely that when I went to ask her for a loan, she often knew how much I was going to require before I opened my mouth. By 1905, the Los Angeles Herald could declare that she was the largest money lender in New York. Her thriftiness, or stinginess, depending upon your position, became a thing of legend. She was said to not use hot water, and that she only wore one pair of clothes until they wore out. Papers even claimed that she ate only oatmeal, eggs, and onions, all unheated to avoid paying for gas. She did often eat onions as a home remedy against colds, which gave her a reputation of having bad breath. When a hernia bothered her in her old age, she went to a doctor to see about fixing it. When he told her that the only option was an expensive surgery, she replied, "You're all alike. You're just a bunch of robbers." She used a stick to press the hernia in and went on her way. Once she carried $200,000 in bonds to her banker, walking through New York. He admonished her and said that she should have taken a carriage for safety. "A carriage indeed," she said. "Perhaps you can afford to ride in a carriage, but I cannot." Flowers in her home were actually dyed chicken feathers. The press called her nasty, unpleasant, and greedy. Her opinion was that papers treated her unfairly. Just because I do dress plainly and do not spend a fortune on my gowns, they think I'm a cranky or insane. More positively, another wrote that she is full of quaintly original sayings, New England shrewdness, and gumption. She is down on trusts, lawyers, professional reformers, and new woman fads. She believes in the bicycle, but draws the line at bloomers. While another accused her that she has reduced money-making to a fine art and let avarice replace some of women's highest attributes. Stories were told that she dropped a brooch as if it were something hot when she learned it cost 75 cents. For her own part, she said she believed in discreet charity. She gave to schools and hospitals, but never bragged about it. When clients of hers struggled to pay on property, she was known to lower the rate of interest to meet his purse. She was famously sneaky about avoiding property taxes. She never kept a home. She would just move from boarding house to boarding house. When one tax assessor asked her where she slept, she said, "I don't know. Can't you recommend a place?" When Greater New York was formed from the 5 boroughs in 1898, she hopped the river to live in Hoboken. She made money in bonds and real estate, but she did little speculating and never borrowed money. She was especially fond of a dog named Dewey, who she said she liked because he didn't know how rich she was. She continued to work nearly until her death. She died on July 3rd, 1916, at age 81. The New York Times reported that she had a series of strokes. Her wealth at the time was estimated at between $100 and $200 million, the equivalent of about $2 and $4 billion today. Her kids inherited most of it, and neither one had any children. Both would get through the Depression using her same strategy of not investing in risks and keeping a large cash supply. On her daughter's death in 1951, $200 million was left. Nearly all of it donated to colleges, churches, and charities. Like someone throwing handfuls of money from a tall building, according to one writer. Hetty Green was so famous that her name appeared in songs along with the likes of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. Yet she was really very little like the typical opulent rich of the Gilded Age, many of whom could claim that they had won and lost many fortunes by playing fast and loose with railroad speculation or trying to corner markets. Where they helped to cause crashes, she helped lend through them by being canny and scrupulous, an antithesis of the age of fast and opulent living. For her, making money was a duty and a responsibility, and keeping it was something of a scoreboard. She was proud to outthink and held grudges against those who wronged her. But she wasn't a robber baron, and in private she was said to be gracious, friendly, and clever. For all her reputation of being a crabby miser, Hetty Green left behind no journals expressing her own thoughts, and so much of what we know about the elusive Hetty Green comes from journalism at the time, the yellow press of the likes of William Randolph Hearst. Perhaps a deeper insight into who she actually was came close to her death when one of her friends said to her, "You have been such a patient invalid, so good and kind to those about you." And she responded, "God has been kind to me, so why shouldn't I be good and kind to others?" I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.